I'm muting.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to the odd week. We're doing this a little off, but we got to finish this up here before Thanksgiving. But anyways, welcome back to Church History, Vastly Oversimplified. We're in the home stretch here. We're almost done. This is it. This is the last one. We've made it all the way up to through the 30 Years' War, and now we're going to start talking about the revival movement. All right. So. My standard disclaimers, I am just going to keep saying them every time. Yeah, there's a lot left on the chopping block. There's a lot of details. It is oversimplified. I'm going for the narrative over the details, but just to keep it in frame. I'm not an expert on this. This is not my area of expertise. So I just read some books and stuff, and I'm probably wrong about something. And as always, I will do my best to be very clear on when something is my opinion versus historically factual. All right. All right, here's our timeline overall. And we're all the way on the right-hand side here. We've already gone through, you see the 30 Years' War, and now we're going to get into all that mess there on the right-hand side. And we're going to end up about 1800 is where we're going to end this. So there's still a couple hundred years of history between where we're going to end in today, but we're going to set a stage for what the modern world looks like. What we're talking about tonight is the revival movement. And so that's just kind of the time frame, and a lot of it is going to be, well past, the last time we left off was 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, and we're going to pick up from there and go on. So, okay, this is where we left off last time. And I still don't know what this allegory painting is all about. But you have the Reformation kicks off. You have first it's Lutheranism and Catholicism are your choices. There's the War of the Holy Roman Empire versus the Schmalkald League, I think is what it's called. Probably mispronounced that. And that ends with the idea that, well, you can choose. The ruler of a region can decide whether you want to be their region is going to be Catholic or they're going to be Lutheran, which was a problem because there was another strain called Calvinism, along with 8,000 other strains. But at first, it was a fairly small number of strains. And then, of course, the Peace of Westphalia said after a massive 30 years war where millions of people, mostly civilians, were killed, massive devastation of what's today Germany. Um, they said, well, the local ruler can decide whatever they want. Like, can be whatever. It's their decision. We're not going to fight wars over this anymore. And that was really what the point is that Christendom, this idea that everybody had to be part of society that was a Christian society where everybody was conscripted into this society at birth through infant baptism and conformity to the society was the most important thing. That's going away now, and it's not overnight. But the Peace of Westphalia puts the final nail in the coffin. It's not gonna come back from this, and a new idea of denominationalism comes in. And denominationalism is fundamentally the idea that, well, you've got some things right, I've got some things right, nobody's got it all right. Let's just agree not to kill each other over it. We can agree to disagree and be civil about it. And that's basically kind of the world that we live in today still. Um, and so that's where we left off last time, is at the end of this 30 Years' War. Christendom is going away and denominationalism is coming in. All right. This is kind of a family, well, it's more a religion, but most of this is Christian family tree here. And you can't read it. Like, don't try to read it. The point isn't to read it. The point, all I want to make is just how much Christianity there is. So one of the things that the Catholic Church, they didn't allow people to read the Bible. They had everything was in Latin for a reason, and nobody spoke it except for the Catholic priests. They were controlling information. They didn't want random everyday Joe to be able to read and understand their Bible because that way they controlled information. Because their concern was that if you let Tom, Dick, and Harry go and read their Bible, they would come up with Tom's version of Christianity, Dick's version of Christianity, and Harry's version of Christianity. And guess what happens? As soon as the Protestant Reformation hits, Luther starts translating the Bible into German along with other people. You get every Tom, Dick, and Harry coming up with different types of Christianity. And that's the point of this. And what the reason I'm putting this up here is because many of these things are happening in parallel. So this section that we're going to talk about, it's kind of difficult to teach because it's not one thing and leads to another thing, which leads to another thing. It's this one thing that led to an explosion of things that are all now intermingling and happening at the same time. So that's kind of just the point I wanted to go make out of this eye chart. But if you want to talk about this chart a little bit, let me get the pointer out if I can remember how to do this. I think it's this thing. And then we go, oh, there we go. All right. So if we get Christianity here, you've got the Roman Catholic Church on the left, you have the Protestantism in the right and the center, and the Eastern Orthodox in the right. And out of Protestants, you get, here's Lutheranism, here's Anglican, which is, and radiate I am, and, starts his own church. That's Anglican in England. You have the Reformed Church. So this is Zigley, which we didn't talk about, and Calvin. They go kind of the Calvinist route. And we have the Anabaptists, which again we didn't talk about, which is a great story. But the Anabaptists basically are, in my opinion, they were trying to recreate the post-apostolic church. Their doctrine, what they were trying to do, it's very close to what the post-apostolic church was, and they were heavily persecuted. Today there are Mennonites. There's a few other churches. The International Churches of Christ eventually come out of this tree. And then there's the Pentecostal Charismatic, or also known as, apparently they want to be known as like continuationists is their new name. But anyways, we're not going to talk about them either. So anyway, I just wanted to show what kind of the family tree was for just a second, and just to give some context. So we've got all these different. Let me go back just for a second. Hello. So again, the point of this is just to show the magnitude, how many different movements, that Christianity doesn't split, it fractures, and it turns into 1,000 different groups. And I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Okay, so the rise of denominationalism. So as we said, 30 Years' War, you have the concept of Christendom, it's on its way out. Actually, at the Peace of Augsburg, it's like the final, is really the initial death blow, but Christendom's going to hold on for a while. But it's on the way out, and on the rise is denominationalism. And there's several things that are causing this rise of denominationalism. One is the 30 Years' War, which we've already talked about. And I'm not going to talk about it anymore, I promise. You're probably all sick and tired of it. The second thing is the New World, and the third is the Enlightenment. All right, so let's talk about the New World. So while all this is going on, while the 30 Years' War is going on, you have Europeans heading to the New World to colonize it, and that's North America, Central America, South America. It's all over, and this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs on the screen here. If you're familiar with it, it basically says that you can't go up the pyramid until you've dealt with the bottom, the level below. So it starts with like, can I breathe? Am I, starving? Am I dying of thirst? If you're any of those things, you can't do anything higher up the tree if you're not, alive. So the basic is, and then as you go up the ladder, you get to the higher and higher things. Now, the reason why am I even talking about this? You guys hear me? Yep. Okay. I just got a unstable internet warning. Okay. Hopefully I'm still here. Anyway, so the reason I'm talking about this is because when these colonists go to the New World, they're on level 0 of the pyramid. They're in a world where there's no infrastructure, there's nothing, right? They are hacking out a new civilization in a untapped virgin wilderness. And yes, there are people living there, and that's part of the problem. And I'm not going to go into the whole evils of colonization or anything like that. I'm just trying to point out that for those people going to the New World, they had much, much more important things than differences in religion. Like on this Maslow's hierarchy, where's arguing over religion? Somewhere near the top. So basically, they're not fighting in the New World over religion. They're just trying to survive, at least early on. And then as the colonies get established, as time goes by, and you now have like civilization taking root, you still don't have people fighting over things because if you have a problem with your neighbor, you could stay and fight your neighbor, or you could just pack up and move west because there's still more to the west. And for most people, it was just easier and simpler to just pick up and move west. And so you just didn't have people fighting over religion in the New World. Um, they either self-separated or they would mix, especially once you get past the early colonial age. You start getting into the early United States, like post the American Revolution. You have Europeans flooding into the United States, this early in the United States, and they're all heading out west to the what today is like the Midwest. You're all going out to Kansas, right, and Oklahoma and Iowa, and they're setting up farms and they're setting up towns and they're starting to farm this, Great Plains. And you would have towns that were these tiny little towns, and you have a complete mix of Catholics and Protestants of all different flavors and who knows what. And religion wasn't an issue. They just got along. In fact, these towns would be so small that there wasn't enough people to support like a Catholic priest or a Lutheran priest. You would have like a town hall that was also the church, that was also the courthouse, that was also the jail, probably. You had like one civic building in the center of town, and you would actually have itinerant ministers would come through. So you might go months without having any ministry at all, and then a Catholic priest would roll into town, and they would spend a couple weeks or a month there, and they would do communions and baptisms and services and marriages and weddings and funerals and whatever. They would do whatever they needed to do for a few weeks or a few months, and then they would pack up and move to the next town because, next town needs them too. And then some months later, some, Calvinist preacher would come in and they would do all those things. And nobody cared. Like one week you're a Catholic and the next week you're a Lutheran. Like it didn't matter. It was just, hey, there's, the preacher. And so in the New World, this idea of fighting over and doctrines and fighting over details, it's not important. The New World starts it inadvertently gets into denominationalism just because of its size and Maslow's hierarchy here, and it stays that way even after, because you have in the United States at least the First Amendment of the Constitution says you will not dictate government. It's a total separation of government and religion, which is radical at the time, right? That is the anti-Christendom concept. Anyways, that's what I want to talk about the New World. So the New World is setting an example. It's a place where denominationalism is there from day one. It grows, it flourishes, and it really sets the like example for the rest of the world for how denominationalism can work. Okay, the other piece, the Enlightenment. And oh my goodness, do I want to talk about this? I want to talk about this for hours, but I don't have time. One of my heroes there, Isaac Newton, apparently he was not a nice person, but brilliant. Absolute, probably the smartest person who's ever lived. If the highest achievement in science is the Nobel Prize today. If the Nobel Prize existed when Isaac was around, he would have gotten 3 in 2 different fields, 2 for physics and 1 for math. That's kind of a big deal. Like this guy is, he is like maybe the smartest person who's ever lived. Okay, just most incredible. Anyway, why am I talking about him? Okay, what's the Enlightenment? I should back up a little. So let's go all the way back to cavemen for a minute. No, actually, I got a better idea. Uh, how does the human brain work? I promise I won't take all night with this. Okay, how does the human brain work? Humans have a superpower. The reason why we work so well, why we're so smart and everything, is because our brains operate by making a model of something. And my favorite example of this is my oldest son, Asher, when he was just a wee little toddler. His favorite thing to do is we had in the living room, we had a coffee table, and he had a whole bunch of these little cars, toys, and he would line up all the cars right on the edge of this coffee table. And he would come along and just push one after the next, after he'd lined them all up, push them over the edge, one after the other, and watch them as they fall into the pile. Then, when they were all knocked over, he'd pick them up and put them back onto the thing and do it again, and do it again, and do it again. He was making a model. His brain was learning. He was trying to come up with, if something falls off, when something leaves the edge and it's not supported, it falls. Like, that's what the model he was building. And he was reinforcing it. And that's like your brain gets all the happy juices released when you reinforce your model. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep in the psychology of it. But this is our superpower. This is how humans are so good at everything and so smart, is because we operate by making models. And with models, you can make predictions. With predictions, you can optimize. It's amazing what you can do with models. And so the idea, since cavemen times, people have been trying to make models for how the universe works. How does nature work? How does, like Asher's pushing the things off the edge? Like, why? How does that work? And we've failed. That's the thing. And it was called natural philosophy for, until Newton's time, basically, until the Enlightenment. And natural philosophers have been trying to come up with models, and they just keep failing because there's always a counterexample. And let me try to give you a really simple example. And I'm making this up, but this is kind of close to what, the real actual kind of natural philosophy would say. You would say something like, make observations like, okay, if I take a piece of wood and I put it in water, it floats. If I take a piece of wood and I put it in fire, it burns. Now let me take a rock. If I put it in water, it sinks. If I take that rock and put it in fire, it doesn't burn. So there's something about the nature of things that float that make them burn, and there's something about the nature of things that sink that make them not burn, or some relationship there, right? Okay, I've just created a model. Now you hand me a piece of coal. Coal sinks because it's a rock, and yet you put it in fire and it burns. Model blown up. That model doesn't work. That doesn't explain how the universe works. And that's the problem that humans have been having since cavemen time, is that every time we created a model, there was always a counterexample. Something always broke it. Until Newton. And the apocryphal story, which is absolutely 100% not true, but it's a fun story, is that Newton's one day, he's sitting in the ground under an apple tree, and he's staring at the moon. And people have known that the Earth is round and that the moon orbits the Earth since the Greeks, right? So he's sitting there and he's looking at the moon. And he's going, "Why do you stay there? What is it that's holding you there? What's making you move in the way that you're moving?" And supposedly an apple at that moment falls out of the tree and bonks him on the head. And he has this aha moment that whatever it was that's holding the moon in the sky is the same thing that caused the apple to fall from the tree. And that's supposedly how he comes up with the theory of gravity. The force of gravity equals capital G M1 M2 over R squared. Equations of motion come out of that. But the important thing is that for the literally first time in human history, somebody has come up with a description, a model for how the universe works, and it works every single time. All the heads exploded on Earth at the same time, because whenever the model would break, it was always left, well, okay, well, a wizard did it, right? That's where, angels and demons made things happen. Gods and spiritual things. Supernatural was how you could explain all the failures in the model. Now you had a model that worked and it didn't require any angels, demons, or supernatural anything. So I can't overstate how much this changes human view of the universe. In fact, it affects Christianity in one way, that there's an entire new kind of view of Christianity called deism. And a deist, basically, and the analogy they used often was watchmaker. They talked about God, the creator God, as this watchmaker. And he creates these finely tuned gears that all fit together perfectly. And he's created this mechanically complicated, perfect universe. And he's sitting there watching it run. And in the early deists, it was still like a God that, like, of the Bible that, what cared about humanity, and it was all for God's purpose. But it doesn't take long before people start taking it into the realm of like what we'd call agnosticism, where you have a creator God that's created this watch universe, and then they either don't care about us, or we're entertainment, like we're like bacteria on a petri dish, like who knows what. Like it's an impersonal God. But the early ages of the Enlightenment, the deism was more of a um, Christianity without any of the mysticism. And in fact, most of the founding fathers of the United States, Benjamin Franklin and I know Thomas Jefferson and others, they were all deists. If you there's like a Jefferson Bible that's where Jefferson went through and all, like the New Testament, and he took out everything that looked like it was supernatural, and you're left with a very very thin Bible because there's whole chunks missing. Um, but that was their view, that no, there is no supernatural. There is no, it's everything is just these like laws of physics, and it's this clockwork universe. Anyway, um, but the point is the Enlightenment creates a world where you no longer need superstition. You don't need supernatural to explain the universe. You introduce this idea that the whole universe is actually operating on these laws, and all we have to do is find these laws, and then we can make predictions. We can make the perfect society based around the way the universe works. That's the goal of the Enlightenment. It doesn't go all that well, but we'll get there. Okay, finally to the topic. What time is it? I'm only halfway through. No problem. All right, halfway through, and here we finally get to the revival movement. But all of that was to say, denominationalism is on the rise because of all those things: 30 Years' War, the New World, colonialization, and this Enlightenment, which is kind of taking the steam out of and a lot of the steam out of religion again. All right, so now we get to the revival movement, and we got to talk about an interesting man named John Wesley. Okay, John was child 15 of 19. Can we pour one out for his mother, Susanna? Oh my goodness. Now, many of you know, I think my wife, Mom of the Millennium, if there was a Mom of the Millennium Award, I'm nominating my wife. Susanna, she had a weekly Bible study time with each one of her 19 children while running a household of 19 children. Now, my wife has had daily Bible times with like our kids almost every day of the week. But I can do the math, and 3 versus 19, I don't know. I think Susanna might have an edge. But remember, Chelsea's also married to me. So I don't know. Chelsea, maybe. Mom of the Millennia. Okay. You guys can vote in the comments. All right, anyways. So Susanna was apparently a very amazing woman. She was very structured, organized, spiritual, and she put her stamp on Wesley. John Wesley was spiritual, structured, organized. It rubs off. He's in England. He's born in England. And he becomes an Anglican minister because that's the religion of England. And he's teaching at Oxford. He's as a young, fresh out of school, he goes straight into teaching at Oxford. And he's there, and one of his younger brothers, I don't know which number of 19, but somewhere between 16 and 19, is going to school at Oxford, and his brother is really concerned at this rise of deism. Like there's a whole bunch of the faculty, the students, like deism is the hot new thing, and he looks at it as like atheism almost, like it's like so not Christian and not biblical. And so he convinces his brother John, hey, we should start a club. and they call it the Holy Club. But that's not the name that stuck. And anyway, they create this club, and the members of the club every day would get up, they would pray, they would study their Bible, they would go to church every day to pray, um, they would get together to talk about things that they study. They were very regimented, scripted. This, do this, do this, do this. It's almost like, you had a mother of 19 or something like that kind of structure and organization. But their detractors made fun of them and they called them Methodists, as in like, they reduced Christianity to this method, checklist. But of course, that's the name that stuck. And yes, the Methodist Church is eventually going to come out of John Wesley and this little holy club. It's going to take a while. And in fact, John never wanted to split from the Anglican Church. Even though as he gets old, before he dies, the Anglican the Anglicans have basically disowned the Methodists, and the Methodist Church is basically its own thing. But he refused. He refused to see himself as anything but Anglican, and it wasn't until after he died that it officially fully broke apart. But anyway, that's not important. The point is, this is the guy that started the Methodist Church. All right, but now we got to pick up the story here. 1736, John Wesley he gets a job as like the minister for Savannah, Georgia, the colony in Savannah, Georgia. And so that is a statue on the screen there that's in Savannah, and which is interesting because we'll get there. So he's on the ship, he's sailing across the Atlantic on a ship going to Savannah, and they hit a storm, and the ship is like, it's bad. Like the ship is like, people are freaking out. When the sailors are panicking, it's time to panic. And he is terrified. He's like, I'm gonna die. I'm gonna die, and I am terrified. And on this ship was a group of Moravians, and we'll talk about them in the next slide or so. But the Moravians, this group of men, women, and children, they're calm as cucumbers in the middle of this while the ship is like gonna sink. They're just calm as cucumbers. They're just sitting there singing hymns to God, like, it's just a Sunday afternoon. And they're not scared at all. And so obviously the storm dies down, the ship doesn't sink. And then after the fact, John goes to this Moravian minister and he says, like, weren't you scared? Weren't your women and children scared? And he just says, no, we're not afraid to die. Like almost like, you know, why are you afraid to die? And it had a very profound impact on John, but we'll get to that. Okay. Meanwhile, he gets to Savannah, starts his job, and there's no other word for it but fiasco. It's a total disaster. First of all, he had ideas in his head that he was going to be this great minister and convert all the Native Americans were all going to be converted to Christianity, and it was going to be this great. No, I will not repeat what he has to say about the Native Americans because it's not nice, and I'm just not going to say it. But he did not get along with the natives. He also didn't quite get the denominational memo. So he shows up there and he's thinking like, well, I'm an Anglican minister. And so there was like one event where I think it was a wedding, I don't remember. But some non-Anglicans wanted to get married and he's the priest, right? He's the minister in town. So they go to him and say, "Hey, can we get married? We want you to marry us." And he's like, "Oh, but no, I won't because you're not Anglican." And that really made the town mad because again, in the New World, denominationalism is the hotness. It doesn't matter if you're Anglican, you do the wedding. We don't argue over little details like that. So that made people mad at him. And then of course he had lady problems. Oh my goodness, he had 99 problems and they were all one woman. Okay, it was his fault too. But so he was engaged to this woman, and there was another guy who was trying to like, swoop in, and John didn't handle it well. He basically used his position as a minister to like try to like kick the guy out of the church, and it was really obvious it was just because of the lady problems. She ends up ending the engagement, and he basically leaves the town in disgrace, like utter fiasco. Like nothing went right, complete failure, and he heads back to England. Now we got to talk about Moravians. We got to take a little side tangent, and then we'll get back to story of John here. We got to talk about who the Moravians were. So go way back, rewind in the late 1600s, early 1700s. There was a guy named Philip Spencer. He was a Lutheran minister, and he's in the city of Frankfurt. And when he gets there, he's told, all right, here's what you need to teach the people. And it's like doctrine, 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 doctrine. And he's looking at the like people that are in his like city, and he's like, these people are, they don't know anything. Like they forget doctrine. These people are mean and evil, and they have no concept of morality. They are just, they're awful. They don't look like Jesus at all. And so he just chucks what he's supposed to teach into the garbage, and he just starts preaching from morality. He preaches from the Sermon on the Mount. He preaches about love thy neighbor, and Jesus stuff, right? And that begins what's called the piety movement. And this was never a really big thing, but their focus was on not doctrine, but on personal piety, personal righteousness, personal morality. Water break. Brought water today. All right. But they weren't a very big movement. They were very small because that wasn't the thing. This is still Christendom. Like this era is still Christendom is still alive and kicking. And so they're not very popular. But there was one notable guy, a count, a notable. I did not do that on purpose. This noble Count von Zinzendorf, and he was a piet. He was raised as a pietist. And so when the people from Moravia were kind of getting kicked out of their land because they weren't Lutheran or whatever, they were looking for somewhere to go. And this guy said, "Hey, here's a whole tract of my land. I'll just give it to you. You can we'll create a commune there, their own community, and it's called Herrnhut." And so in this land that this guy owned somewhere in Germany, I don't remember where, he sets up this little community, and it's like this closed off thing where only the piety members were there, and they were called Moravians because they came from Moravia. But anyway, that's not important. But this Moravian group, their focus was not on doctrine. It was on, like I said, the piety movement. It was about your personal relationship with God, and it was this focus on experiencing Jesus, experiencing the love of God. And they had a strong missionary vision. So they were kind of protected in this little county where they kind of had this land, but they would go and send missionaries out all over the world. And that's where you see the Moravians on that ship with John Wesley. That's why they were there, as they were heading to Georgia to go start a Moravian commune there in Georgia. And there's not, yeah, that's enough said about the Moravians. Okay. So that's where they come from. So back to John Wesley's story, going back and forward in time. Sorry for the temporal whiplash. 1738, he comes back to England after his failure in Georgia. And one of the first things he does is like, I got to figure out what these Moravians are all about, because that's the thing that really sticks with one of the things. But it was a really profound moment when he was on that ship and he saw them and they were like, yeah, we're not scared to die. Why are you? He's like, oh yeah, good question. Why am I scared to die? So he goes and he meets with a Moravian preacher in London. The Moravian preacher just basically says, you need to experience Jesus. Like you need to experience God. That's what's missing in your life. And he doesn't know what that means. And Wesley goes off and he's like trying to figure this out. And so, and one day he's sitting there at some like, Bible study with the, little old ladies or whatever, Anglican ministers do on a Tuesday afternoon or wherever it was. And they're reading Romans. And stop me if you've heard this before, but somebody is reading Romans and has this life-altering epiphany moment. And then it completely reshapes their whole view of Christianity, and they go and take that in to make major changes that change the world. Yes, this is the third time we had Augustine was the first, and then we had Luther did the same thing, and now we've got Wesley. So 3 times in this class, we've had somebody reading Romans and has an epiphany that changes their whole life. So apparently, if you want a spiritual epiphany, read Romans. Anyways, I'm just going to read a quote from him. This is Wesley's own words on what happened to him. And he says, "I felt that I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." And I want to emphasize felt. I felt. It was this experience. It was feelings. It was not doctrine. It wasn't studying. Like, remember when Augustine has his like epiphany moment, he's reading and it's about doctrine. It's about salvation, the forgiveness of sins, but it was the doctrine of it. When Luther's reading and he has his epiphany moment, it's about grace and about and it's doctrine. This is about emotion. This is more about like the feeling of experiencing this salvation. That's important because that really informs this revival movement. All right, now we got to take another little detour. George Whitefield comes onto the stage. Now, George was one of those Holy Club members at Oxford. So he was there. He actually went with Wesley to Georgia when Wesley went there. But he came back to England before the fiasco, or at least early on, so he could become ordained. So he comes back to England, he's ordained, and but he's really unhappy with how things are going because he, the church, like if you were like the Anglican church was mostly populated by people who were more middle or upper class. It was very intellectual. It was all focused on doctrine. And for the vast majority of people in England, your coal miners, your farmers, your mill workers, your whatever, like you're just lower average Joe, they went into church when they were baptized as an infant, they went in there for weddings and they went there for funerals. And that was it. You didn't go to church on Sunday. You didn't hear, it, they wouldn't have understood what they were talking about anyways, not because it wasn't in English, but it was because they're talking doctrine. They're talking about like how many angels could dance on the head of a pin or something stupid like that. And so George is like, this is stupid. This is dumb. I'm going to go out to the masses. And so he does something radical. He just goes out to this coal mining town. And instead of going to the church, he just goes out to the coal mine, basically. And he goes to the people. And in public, he just starts preaching just to the people. And he has this incredible turnout. Thousands of people come out to hear him speak. And he has a style that today we call fire and brimstone. So it usually started with something about the power and majesty of God and how God is going to punish the sinners and descriptions of hell and fire and damnation and then it switches to the grace of God and how no matter who you are, what you've done, you can repent and God will just save your soul and you will be forgiven and it's this emotional and it ends with this strong emotional appeal to save yourself from this, repent and live a godly life and he was great at it. He was absolute genius at it. And he had incredible turnout. So he started going from like town to town, traveling all over and doing these open air, out in public preaching sessions where thousands, tens of thousands would come to listen to him. And they would be so moved. They talked about like the coal miners who still were covered in coal dust. You could see the tears cutting lines in their dark faces because they were so moved by it. Excuse me. And so that's George Whitefield. He's out there doing this, and his buddy is John Wesley. So he's like saying, "Hey, you got to come and do it. You got to come see this. You got to see what's happening. This is amazing. You got to come and do it." And John Wesley's like, he's like your high Anglican, Oxford educated gentleman preacher guy, right? Like standing in front of a whole bunch of like commoners, and low level peasants, basically, that's not his crowd. So he's terrified. And eventually he goes. And at one, I don't remember what the town was, he goes and he stands up in front of this crowd and starts preaching. And if I should have added a meme here, This is Peter Parker being bitten by the radioactive spider. John Wesley gets his superpower unlocked. It turns out this guy is a master at mass public preaching. This whole fire and brimstone style, this emotional appeal, you need to repent, you need to like live as a Christian, you need to experience Jesus, you need to experience his grace and love. He's a master, natural. And so he starts from then on. He basically never steps foot in a church again. He goes on and he travels for thousands and thousands of miles all over England, doing these open air, um, and eventually this kind of church coalesces around it called the Methodists. But that's not the important part. The important part is that this starts what's called the revival movement. And it's this idea of preaching to a large crowd, not inside of a church. Traditionally it was done outside. And it starts with George Whitefield. He invents it. He goes to the United States, and there was actually kind of like a similar thing going on in the American colonies, but he shows up and he basically sets the example, and he gets imitated, and it really explodes in the colonies, and it's called the First Great Awakening. Is this period of time in history? If you want to read more about it. Um, and America was like primed for this. Remember, like I said, it's this melting pot. You have that town in Kansas where the preacher is one week it's a Lutheran and next it's whatever. You have people they don't care about doctrine, but they're also basically unchurched. Like nobody is talking about like the Christendom. Remember Christendom? Nobody talked about personal righteousness. Nobody talked about, there was no emphasis on how you lived. It was about obeying and being part of the structure of society. Conformance was the key. So now we're switching out of that into this denominational world. So you have people that are like the people in Frankfurt that what's his face that started the piety movement. You have people that don't know. They don't know. You think that they're Christians in the sense that they were baptized. Like almost every one of these movements believes in infant baptism. The only ones that don't, the Anabaptists. That was like what made them weird. But everybody else believes that you are baptized as an infant. So all these people that George Whitefield and John Wesley, they're not preaching to convert people. They're already Christians. They're preaching to awaken them. They're preaching to get them to ignite their spirituality, to experience Jesus, to experience God. It's not about conversion, it's about experiencing God. And America's perfect for that because there is no emphasis on doctrine. They're ready for this message. So when these revival movement hits the United States, it just explodes. And I'm going to tell you, you can literally connect the dots from George Whitefield all the way to Billy Graham. Billy Graham, like 1940s, maybe 50s until 1990s or so. You know, he basically was doing this. This is what he was doing. And you can connect the dots directly. It's like one generation after another, straight from Whitefield to the modern day. This is the revival movement. This is the theology, well, the lack of theology that's pushing this. And that's what I want to talk about. This is not theology driven. The when you go all the way back through Christendom was theology driven. It was theologians talking about doctrine that was pushing what the church was doing and what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. The Reformation, Luther, doctrine. It was about doctrine. It's about pushing doctrine. It's about making sure we're doing the right doctrine. The revival movement is the inverse. We don't care about doctrine. It's not about doctrine. It's about experiencing Jesus. It's about experiencing God's grace. It's the experience. And so a lot of this revival movement, the things that are happening are not being driven by doctrine. They're being driven by this need to awaken people, to have these people experience Jesus. So at the beginning, it's not like you're trying to convert people, but what happens is what are you telling them? You're telling them you need to make a decision. You need to change. You need to accept this grace that God is giving you. You need to start living a life that looks like Jesus's life. It just takes like nothing to switch that message to a conversion message that you need to convert. You need to, this is a conversion for you. And at first, yeah, you're already baptized. We're just awakening something. But it very quickly, well, not very quickly, over time, it becomes a conversion message. And that's where we get the pray Jesus in your heart today. Like the idea of accepting Jesus comes directly out of this revival movement, that is not about doctrine. But just as nature abhors a vacuum, Christianity abhors a doctrinal vacuum. And so what you have are the preachers, and the ministry is pushing forward with the action. They're just out there preaching this message. They're not doing it based on some sort of doctrinal basis. So, but what happens, of course, is that theologians come in behind them and start filling in that gap. They start filling in the doctrine. And that's really where I want to kind of end this. I want to talk about the doctrinal part of this. So here I'm trying to put up these two different ideas. In Christendom, the theology was doctrine driven, personal morality was not important. And it was, of course, all society. So you were basically conscripted through the mechanism of infant baptism, you were conscripted in. You didn't have a choice necessarily. But with revival theology, it's now experience or relation driven. It's about the experience, it's about acceptance, it's about relationship with God. It's not about doctrine. We don't care about doctrine. Doctrine is how you got the 30 Years' War. We don't want that anymore. That's how people fight. Let's not fight over this. Don't worry about doctrine. This is a denominational world. You do what you do, we do what we do. It doesn't matter. What's important is that you accept Jesus, that you have this experience of God in your life, and you allow that to change you, to essentially repent, metanoia, to change the way you think. That's making a comeback. And there is an element of individualism here. This no, this is not a conscription thing. You get to do this. Like you those revival meetings, you showed up on your own. Like you were not, nobody grabbed a gun or a pitchfork and said, call out the National Guard, we're going to drag everybody. No, it was, you decided to go and listen to that message. You decide if you want to respond to that message. And at the beginning, it was like the masses would respond. But as time goes by, it starts to change to be more of a, you come in and respond in this message, right? This is where you get the altar calls. This is where you get the come forward and, stand here and say, I'm going to repent and I'm going to turn my life to Jesus and I'm going to live a godly life, to the point where then you start getting it replaced with baptisms, and where you start getting that replaced with a call to prayer, kneel at the altar and pray Jesus into your heart, that kind of thing. That's where that all evolves into. And so for some, it was like you accepted this through your life, your personal righteousness, your repentance, your walk with God, your personal relationship with God. And other times there was also sometimes an outward act. Sometimes that was baptism. Sometimes that was just a public confession. Sometimes there wasn't anything public. It would be completely private. But the point was that you made a decision. And so the real thing that I walk away from this, in my opinion, is that conversion is back on the menu, boys. Because conversion has been lost. The concept of conversion, and this is where I'm gonna end with the post-apostolic church. They had, the baptism played a role. So let me back up. As these theologians are coming in and trying to like backfill the theology that supports what people are doing in this revival movement, the thing that they kind of run into is baptism. Because if you look at even today, like Catholic Church, Lutheran, a bunch of other movements, they will say even today that baptism is how you get your original sin forgiven. It's like how you get your foot in the door. And then what you do beyond that, there's like, you could be super Christian, or you could just be like barely escaping the fires of hell Christian. but baptism is this thing where you kind of get your foot in the door and you are that's but it's done without your consent. Like you're typically done as a baby. So for the revivalist view, they're like, well, what role does baptism play? Like, if you have to make this choice, if choice is an incredible part, if conversion, a choice that you make, is part of this, then what does an infant baptism do? And so a lot of them, a lot of the theology of today just takes baptism and throws it out completely. They say there is baptism is it's some even call it a work, they don't want you to do it because it's like a work or something. Um, so that's really the theological struggle that I see going on today, is that you have kind of the post-apostolic view of baptism, where you had, if you remember way back at the beginning, how did people become a Christians in the post-apostolic period? You had to have people like reach out to you. You basically studied, you people studied with you and taught you what Christianity was, who Jesus was, what he meant, what he taught. You started repenting. You started that act of changing your life. And then when you were ready, they would baptize you. And then that was the final step before you got added to the church and were a Christian. During the Christendom era, kind of Augustine on, you have the Christendom is just, or the Christendom, baptism is just this first step. It just takes away original sin and gets your foot in the door. And that's the role of baptism. For revival, they're like, I don't know what to do with this, because if salvation now begins at the point where you accept, okay, conversion, it's back on the menu. Conversion, just like the post apostolic church, you had to convert to be a Christian. You had to change, you had to accept, you had to make decisions. Christendom took that away. Revival theology puts it back on the menu and says, no, you have to convert. There's a choice that you make to become a Christian, to accept this grace of God, to be part of this relationship with God. So then it's like, well, where does baptism fit? And so for some, baptism was like something that you do, but it's only like a sign. It's just something that, like, you do it because the Bible says you do it or something. I don't know. And then others are like, it's totally optional. You can, you don't need to. Some actually even say don't, um, essentially. But that's kind of the world that we're in today. The theology of the revival is struggling with baptism. It's trying to figure out, where does this fit in the picture. Um, but that's where we get, if you and that's kind of the end. That's all I have. So I'm gonna try in the next, how much time we got? I got 2 minutes. All right. Next 2 minutes, I'm going to try to just kind of sum up everything that we've talked about. Okay. So all the way back, about 100 AD, somewhere in there, John, the Apostle John, the younger, dies. And now we're in the post-apostolic period, shaped by heresies, shaped by persecution. And then Constantine comes along, ends persecution, starts the process of marrying Christianity with the state, because he is the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest. Sets he moves the capital to Constantinople, and that has a lot of things. One, it causes the Western Roman Empire to start to decline. It was already in decline, but that kind of puts a nail in the coffin. And then it also creates this division between the East and the West, and Eastern Orthodox eventually merges off of that. You have with the decline of the Western Empire, you end up with all the barbarians that come along. You have the rise of the Pope. The Leo the First is the one that basically says, "Hey, I'm the guy in charge." And why does he do that? Well, because he's like the guy standing and defending the city of Rome after the sack of the Vandals. He's like the only one standing, and the government's collapsed, and so they take over the government role in the city of Rome. The church does. You have um, and what I was going to say, you also have this fight with the Constantinople Pope, and that's where this like supremacy of the Roman bishop comes from, which he just takes it to its extreme and says, well, the Roman bishop has always been the bishop of everything, and that sets up the papacy. And now you have plus Augustine, and especially his book, The City of God, that sets this doctrine that the state is superior, the church is superior to the state. And now you have Christendom, and that gives birth to the concept of Christendom, where you have a Christian kingdom. You have the Christian merging with the Christianity plus feudalism, creating this symbiotic relationship between the church, especially the Pope, and the secular leaders. And that's Christianity is no longer optional. It's you are mandatory. It's baptism as infants. It's an emphasis on societal cohesion, and eventually you end up the papacy kind of grows in power and wealth until it hits the First Crusade, where it really takes off. But then after the Crusades, it really starts to nosedive, and you have that whole era of the multi-pope, you have that, and you have calls for reform because of the greed and the other negative things that are going on in the Catholic Church. That there have always been calls for reform, and there have been times when it's reformed. I don't want to say make it sound like I'm just trying to throw them under the bus. There were efforts and things that were done to reform the church, but at some point it got really, really bad. That's when uh, you have Luther show up, 95 Theses at the Church of the Wittenberg Church, starts the Reformation movement. He goes completely anti-Pope. All the German princes that were all sick of the Pope and they meddling in their affairs, they jump onto the Luther bandwagon. They basically foster and protect him. The Holy Roman Empire versus Schmalkald War kicks off. You have the Peace of Augsburg, which says, hey, you could choose to be Catholic or Lutheran. Now Christendom is basically dead. Now you have two different kinds of perfect societies that are based on the Bible, but they're totally different. So how are they both perfect? I don't know. Anyway, and then you have, of course, the 30 Years' War because of Calvinism and all the other different versions of Christianity that are exploding. And so now you have Europe basically rejects the concept of Christendom. Denominationalism is the new hotness. You have that sets the stage in especially the colonization of the New World, plus the Enlightenment. Now you have the revival movement, which is now rejecting the concept of doctrine driven, but now it's more experience, emotion, relationship with God focused, and conversion is back, and the concept of personal acceptance, and that's where you eventually get pray Jesus into your heart. So today we live in a world where the majority of Western Christianity doctrinally will tell you that, well, that you become a Christian when you pray Jesus into your heart. And that's kind of the whole point I was trying to get to. And I hope that this was helpful.